Hi, everybody. This is Erica Mello and Susan Clinton, and welcome to episode number 163. And this is actually an episode of a patient I saw probably over a year ago. And I wanted to talk about him basically because he has a lot of issues related to his shoulder and his neck. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about his treatment that did not work prior to him coming in to see me and why. And also why sometimes telling the patient not to do something maybe the one thing that you just need to do. Okay. And it's really more, it's more about less is more with patients. And I think comes down to the clinical reasoning process. So I hope you enjoy it. And Susan and I want also to ask for your testimonials. We made a big push last year to get some testimonials or more testimonials on for our Tough to Treat podcast. And if you're a new listener, and an old listener, we really appreciate you joining us. And if you have not left us a review, either on iTunes or wherever you listen to us, we would urge you to do so. It really helps us, the algorithm find us and helps us to continue bringing you such great content. And hope you enjoy the episode. Hi, everybody. This is Erica Mello, along with my wonderful co-host, Susan Clinton, and welcome to episode number 163. How are you, Susan?
I'm good. Welcome to June, everybody.
Oh, yes. Hallelujah. My gosh. Yes. If you're listening to us as this drops, it will be the beginning of June, literally. And looking forward to a summer. I was telling Susan earlier, I don't remember last summer, but I know we had one. It's just everything sort of blended into one during the pandemic, and it's nice to, look forward to a summer that hopefully I can remember.
Awesome.
All right. Let's just get to it. I have this is a patient of mine, obviously. But I treated him about a year ago, and I wanted to talk about him because, as I mentioned in the intro, sometimes it's about telling your patient not to do certain things that actually gets them better. And it's not actually what you do, but it's what you say to them. So this is a combination of both. So, and I also just wanted to encourage the listeners to think about, making a hypothesis about the patient's driver or what you would do before you actually objectively assess him. Okay. So he, as I said, I saw him about a year ago, and he was probably about in his 40s, early 50s, came to see me with left upper trap, levator scap, sort of neck shoulder pain. He sort of dark in the whole scapula area, upper trap, that whole left glenohumeral neck side of his C-spine. And prior to him seeing me, the injury happened 6 weeks prior. So it wasn't like a persistent complex patient, but he actually had a Brown to physical therapy with some other people here in New York, and he was actually worse. And so I wanted to talk about that a bit and why, and perhaps what could have been done differently. His initial injury started when he was in the gym. He was doing 50, if you can imagine this, 52.5-pound triceps, probably on a supine with the bar above him, just doing skull crushers or supine extensions with a bar plus weights. That's a lot for a tricep muscle. And he was doing it also in standing. So he's supine in standing. And he told me, I highlighted this in my eval, he had his head turned to the right for some reason. Maybe he was looking at the mirror or looking off. I'm not sure why, but he said his head was turned to the right. The next morning he woke up, he was stiff and sore on that left side, right? In that upper trap scapular area. He took 2 weeks off, did not get any better. So he went back to doing his he's into the HIIT routines and the gym. So he went back to doing those, and he still it bothered him to do any kind of overhead. So his main gym focus was like military press, chin ups, tricep extensions, lats, lat pull downs, things like that. He could do the lats, he said, a little bit, but he couldn't do the chin ups or the triceps or overhead press. So he was in for physical therapy 4 times a week, twice a week for 4 weeks, so about a total of 8 visits. What he told me is that they did massage, exercise, and stretching. And he actually was worse. He ended up getting a C-spine MRI. It was non-remarkable, and he was put on some anti-inflammatories. The main issue here is that he was a rower for 8 years. So I know we've talked about one of my other rowers before on the
Mm-hmm.
podcast, right? So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
what do we know about rowers? He was on the right side of the boat, this guy. So
Okay.
about if you're a rower, so right side's, I think it's sculling to the right,
Mm-hmm.
where my other guy was to the left. So that's where he did, you know, most likely in college or and pre and post college as well. So the only other medical history of note was an L5 fracture. That's it.
Of what was the medical history of what fracture?
Yes, he fractured his L5 vertebrae from a fall many
Mm.
years ago. Yeah. And I'm trying to think anything else remarkable. Basically the hip workout, as I mentioned, he was working from home still when I saw him. So just a lot of sitting at the computer. He does sleep on his right side. So his main issue is on his left side. So he's sleeping on his right side. He sprained actually his right ankle as well some years ago jogging. So the main history was the rowing, the right ankle sprain many years ago, and the L5 fracture off a horse. Any questions so far, Susan? Should I keep going?
Was he actively rowing at the time that he had this L5 fracture,
Yes.
or this sprained ankle?
No, not the sprained ankle, but definitely
Okay.
the for L5. Yeah.
So he was rowing and he fell off a horse and fractured his L5. Is that what I heard?
No, he didn't fall off a horse. He just fell. I didn't write it down.
Okay, from a
So
fall. Okay.
from a
But
fall.
but he kept on rowing or he recovered and went back to
He
rowing.
recovered and went back to rowing.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was one of those things. Oh, yes, right. I have an, like, because I'm like, is there anything else that you want to tell me? Because I asked him about past movement and medical history. He didn't tell me that. And then at the
Mm-hmm.
end of the eval, I'm like, the end of this objective, I'm like, is there anything else? He's like, oh, yeah. So it's one of those things that he obviously didn't affect him in a meaningful way because he almost forgot to tell me about it. So
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't on his radar anyway.
Okay.
It was on mine. So, and then the right ankle sprain. So it was curious though, because usually people, when you come to see us, they come from other places or whatever. They're like either not better or they're just getting a little bit better, but not where they want to be. But this guy was highly worse. And so I asked him what he was doing, like what stretches they were doing. So bear in mind, it was his levator scap, his whole sort of scapular area, upper traps. They were giving him upper trap and levator scap stretches. Not sure why. I don't know if it was not sure why, but it was something that, people do give out a lot. And I thought just by the way his head was positioned, then I'll explain that in a second, that probably wasn't the right thing to do. Maybe the right thing, but wrong time, right? So the objectives, he was very much weight bearing on his right side, which is interesting because that's where he had his ankle sprain. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But his head, so I took a look at the head and the neck area just visually, and I mentally draw. Sometimes I'll take a photo with my iPhone, with a normal narrow wide type stance, and he was pretty much the same in all those positions. There wasn't anything like crazy with a narrower base of support. But what I did notice is that his head was very much to the left of his upper thorax and of his upper trunk. Once again, unremarkable for many people. But given that's where his symptoms were, I was like, okay, maybe this is something I need to explore at some point.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The narrow base of support didn't show me anything, even though he did have that right ankle sprain. I didn't think that a lower extremity issue was probably the primary driver. So, but given his history with rowing, I had to prioritize in terms of just the evaluation, head, neck, upper thorax, things like that. And so when I took a look at him, is both of his scapula, both were very dumped, very, very braced, depressed, adducted, really gripping, both of sides, both, not just the left. But the left was really a little bit more so. So if I tried to pick his medial border of his scapula up off the thorax, it would be very hard to get my thumbs in there and kind of do the little wiggle that we learned over the scapular wiggle. Okay, I was able to do that a little bit on the right. I had him just lift his arms up and down, things like that to see if he moved. Left didn't really move so much, his scapula. So just in standing, I put my hands on his head just to get a sense of where I thought he was in space. So what I did is I just married my feet to his. My right was behind his right, my left was behind his left. I closed my eyes, I put my hands on his head, and I just intuitively, I kind of do this thing, and I just think, and he was very much to the left of his upper thorax. I wanted to see if my vision matched my hands.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I took him in front of the mirror as well. And he said he noticed that. And I'm harping on this because it was relevant for him.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want me to keep going, or do you have any
Yeah,
other?
no, keep going.
Okay.
This is good.
Okay, so other than that, in terms of like the scapula, the neck, nothing else remarkable that jumped out. Okay, so I'm going to move on. I evaluated 2 movements for him. What was interesting is that his initial injury happened when his head was turned to the right. Okay, I checked his head rotation to the right and to the left. The left was meaningful. Like he's like, oh, that's really limited. It's bothering me on that same side, on that left side. But I knew I needed to get the
How far
shoulder.
did do you remember how far he rotated to the left?
No, like 30%, not a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I wrote down 30, so I usually
Mm-hmm.
I overestimate that. So, and then I also looked at a single arm lift. So I had him just a bilateral arm lift just to see the difference in side to side. As I mentioned before, the scapulae were really sort of adhered to the thorax, but his right moved. When he lifted his right arm, his right moved, it upwardly rotated, elevated, did what it's supposed to do. The left side did not. So I evaluated a C-spine rotation left and left single arm lift. His meaningful experience for both of those, or I would say not meaningful, was a pinching on the left side of his upper traps and cervical spine and a tightness in his left glenohumeral joint. So if we just think about we'll just start with the rowing position. It is his left side, his left shoulder. He's on the right side of the boat. What position is that left arm in? It's almost like an horizontal adduction, right? Or abduction, right?
Internal rotation.
Internal rotation, right? For years, and he just probably compensated for it until he started doing I think it was these HIIT workouts that really did it. All these people start these heavy workouts, and they're great, but I do think that people who had a history of injuries, which is most people, they should get checked out by a physical therapist beforehand, just because that's a lot of load, when he got himself injured, basically, So anyway, that's one of my soapbox. Okay. So when I had him lift his arm up and turn his head to the left, the first thing I saw, and it was very early, is that when he lifted his left arm up, his head shifted to the left. That was the first thing I saw. When I had him turn his head to the left, I didn't really see a lot. I had to get my hands in there, but it was like he was symptomatic, basically. The shoulder, he turned his head and he just couldn't go any further. I had my hands on his left GH. I didn't really feel any compression, any elevation. It was just a symptomatic movement. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
When I went into his upper thorax because of the history of rowing, although I'm actually ignoring the L5 fracture right now, so we can talk about that. Excuse me.
I have it highlighted.
Okay, so we'll talk about that in a second. So when he lifted his arm up on his left salus, left C-spine rotation, his upper ribs 3 and 4 went way to the right, probably compensating for the head going to the left. Okay, once again, it's just a pure biomechanical explanation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Head goes left, ribs go right, just to sort of keep you from falling over. That's what I felt very early. And for me, when I see something happening early, I take note of it. So do you want to talk about his L5 fracture?
Well, I have it highlighted because to me it seems a bit relevant. Why I was asking if he was rowing while this was going on, because I would imagine that he was limited in his lumbar spine movement following this L5 fracture.
Yep.
I'm assuming it was a fracture of the the fracture of the neck of the Scotty dog, or was it or was it the a burst fracture of his vertebral column?
I think it was the first one. He did not know. It was many years ago.
If he had had a compression fracture, you think either they fall and they hit into extension and break the ramus there, or they land hard and have a burst fracture. And if he had a burst fracture of his or a compression fracture of his lumbar spine, he would be able to tell you that.
Yes.
So therefore, extension's limited, and probably limited more on one side than the other. So I'm just wondering if with the rowing, if it shifted because of how he had to pull back, because there's lumbar extension with loading and rowing.
Yes. Yes.
And so if he was unable to go one way or the other, if that caused him to rotate
It
up
probably,
above
yes.
and do some things. So I'm just wondering if it just kind of set up a pattern that maybe when he was doing the heavy lifting, he was loading and he could, he wasn't able to, that there was a shift and a twist already inherently in his system that
Yes.
couldn't handle the heavy load.
Yes.
Is,
Yes.
is my thoughts on
Yes.
this. I don't know
Yeah.
if that's what you saw. That's what I'm conjecturing in my head.
Yeah, but I'm also thinking too, and what I thought is his left scap was so dumped and braced. It's like he was almost trying to extend, but he was jamming his shoulder blade back on that side,
Mm-hmm.
as well, because he did do his tricep exercise in different positions the day he was injured. He did it in
Right.
standing, and he did it, and he's loading on his right leg in standing, and he did it in supine. So you need obviously some form of extension in there, obviously in both positions. So he didn't think anything of it because he recovered. But I said, you adopt a certain movement pattern over the years because of an injury, and you compensate over years, and it's just an adaptation. And ultimately, it does catch up to you, especially if you're going to lift heavy load like you're doing now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how I explained it to him. And because he was a rower, I thought for the listeners, it's so important to understand like the movement pattern that is associated with a sport that your patient has done for a long time. Especially if you don't know like what a rower does, go on YouTube or something,
Mm-hmm.
and just look at it. Look at what a rower does.
Mm-hmm.
Or plays hockey. You need to know what regions of the body are stressed in those sports in order to put that sort of potential region on your mental or physical magnet board that you need to keep in
Mm-hmm.
mind, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with you, Susan. I think it was relevant. I mean, he just poo-pooed it, but I was like, I don't know about that, but I will tell you what I did. So just moving along here. So I went in, and because his area, because I was still wondering why he was worse. And I think there's many reasons. I think stretching was the wrong thing to do because they're stretching a muscle that is already, I don't even want to say it's on tension. It's just so it's what's the word? It has its own gripping strategy.
Yeah, it's over recruiting.
Exactly.
It's like
Right.
stretching a rubber band.
Thank you. That's exactly right. Stretching a rubber band. And I said, that's probably not helping. So I actually told him to stop that. Okay. So don't
Yeah.
stretch. Okay. And that was even before before I even had my hands on him. I'm like, don't stretch. Stop it. So anyway, I went in and I looked at his left arm lift first. And I literally did some decompression into his head, just literally lifted, had my pinky fingers on like the articular pillars of C6, 7, and just had my hands on the outside of his head. And I just did some decompression. I centered him, just centered his head. And then I just said, I didn't want to do the head lift because I would have to rotate with him. I'm sorry, the head rotation. So I just had him lift his arm up. And I mentally looked at the scapula because I wanted to see if it was moving better when I did that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not. And he's like, oh, I feel good. I don't have a pinch in my neck. I'm like, of course you don't, because I have my hands on you. I'm giving you some decompression, but you're also not turning your head. But he did feel that pinch when he lifted his arm up. So one area was better. The other area was no change. And so in my mind, even though he's like, that feels not bad, that's not good enough for me, because objectively he was not aware of his scapula. It was not his awareness. That was for me. So, but when I saw that gripping pattern, the dumping, the adduction, the depression, that's something. He when he starts lifting his arm up again to do a skull crusher, it's just going to come back to the same old problem. So what I ended up doing is, when I mentally looked in the mirror at a mirror, and I looked at any changes in the upper thorax, like I looked to see if if there's any sort of shifting visually. It's a way you train your eyes. And so I didn't really see much there, to be honest. And so what I ended up doing was I unloaded his left shoulder blade, his left scapula. So I just put my hands, I'm standing behind him. I had my left hand. I just said, elevate your humeral head. I just lift your shoulder up. I stuck my hand under the scapula and just to unload it. And I just said, just turn your head for me. Just turn your head. And he's like, oh, that feels pretty good. And I'm like, okay, left rotation, not bad, right? Lift the arm up, Still not great. I was like, okay, I can treat one area, I can treat both areas, I can treat both together. So when I decompressed his cervical spine, it made his shoulder better. When I decompressed his left, when I took his scapula out of it, it made his um, neck worse.
Mm-hmm.
So when I see that two regions of the body that kind of are making each other worse, quote unquote, I'm thinking there is something in between those two regions that is holding them together literally.
Mm-hmm.
And, I'm still thinking of that L5 thing, but that's going to come into play a little bit more for me in the movement piece.
Yeah.
Right. And so I ended up, for the listeners, I ended up doing both together. I put one hand on his neck, gave him a little decompression, unloaded his shoulder blade, had him turn his head, had him lift his arm up. He's like, that feels perfect. So, and I don't mean that to say perfect, he just had no symptoms. The scapula was moving better. I was just taking out auxiliary muscles that were working that shouldn't be, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So, because I think we lose sight of the scapula, and I think people tend to sort of do these scap stabilization exercises. I think we did a podcast on that a long time ago, and I don't think I have to be honest, Susan, I don't think I've given those exercises out in over 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Those sort of B's, T's, Y's, things like that on the Swiss ball. I do it differently. And so I don't generally think that the scapula in this guy was his primary driver. Okay. I believe it actually was his neck. But if I treated his neck would feel good when he turned his head, but when he lifted his arm up, it wouldn't feel great. So I believe there were two drivers that I'd have to treat together. And that because they both made each other worse, I had to de-link them. And so, do you have any questions? Anything?
No, it makes me think about, I know in open chain he's worse lifting that arm up. I'm just wondering what that would look like if he was in closed chain. And or what if he was rolling a ball up the wall versus lifting his arm up?
Yes.
Would that change the motor pattern enough to make, to change symptoms? That's what I'm thinking here at this point. Is like I would get him out of open chain movement and start looking at closed chain and moving the arm into the positions either in closed chain or in, like what I like to call assisting, like put your finger right in the palm of his hand and follow his arm up as he goes. Does that make it better? So he's got something to push against a little bit. Same rolling a ball up the wall, putting his hand and sliding up the wall. Does it work better when you do that versus just lifting the arm up
with the head in neutral, right? You're saying? Yes. Mm-hmm. So that's a great idea. So what I did is I had him do the normal narrow wide on the wall just in standing.
Yep.
But that was head neutral. So I just saw a little bit of medial compression in the shoulder, a little bit of like that gripping pattern. I did get him on his hands and knees. And I had him go, as a matter of fact, I'm jumping ahead, but that actually became a reset for him. So I got him on his hands and knees, and I had him move forwards, backwards, turning his head, looking down. And he was actually fairly okay with that. Subjectively. Like, oh, that feels pretty good. I'm like, okay, then that's going to be, and objectively, I saw things, but he actually felt pretty okay. So I knew that was a position I had to start him in. And that actually became a reset for him. So I like that. I like it's interesting you mentioned keeping head in neutral, moving the arm, and also keeping the arm in neutral and moving the head, because you want to figure out what the link is, right? Right, the link is. So that's a great idea. So what I ended up doing the first visit, so I did my whole spiel on what I felt the drivers were, and he got that. And he's like, why does stretching make me worse? I like that stretching a rubber band analogy. I'm going to have to use that going forward. But I said, it's probably, you're stretching something that's already too tensed up, and you're doing it in a movement pattern that's not optimal. And he's like, he got that word. If he didn't get that word, I'll say, well, you're doing it you're recruiting muscles that you shouldn't be. And if you're going to continue to stretch, you're just going to reinforce the non-optimal pattern. So he understood that. So what I ended up doing was because he was at home still working, I had him put something on his armrest at home, like a pillow or something, just to keep his arm passively supported while he worked. And he was actually flying after I saw him. And so I ended up taping his left scapula with hypofix and Leukotape, just a sling, just like how I talked about. I put my left hand in his armpit, I unloaded the scapula, I slinged the tape up under the inferior angle, and it just gave him passive support. I
Mm-hmm.
told him to discontinue the stretching and just put something underneath his arms when he was on the plane. I mean, when he was in front of his computer. I did tell him, and I think I've done this twice in 10 years. I had him take a cervical collar with him because it was a long flight. And every time he would turn, he would occasionally get shooting symptoms. And he was like, do you think I need to do something on the plane? I said, you could take a collar with you. And I'm very reluctantly give that out,
Mm-hmm.
but he did. And it helped a lot.
Yep.
And he didn't need it on the way back. So that's what I did the first session. Okay. So he came back and he said the tape really helped him. I was like, of course the tape, because it just unloaded you, right? And
Mm-hmm.
speaking of neural tension, I was actually looking something up after I discharged him. But that's where does that suprascapular nerve? That's like up at C5, 6, right? The peripheral
Mm-hmm.
nerve.
Mm-hmm.
So you think about that nerve that's just being, either compressed or tensioned.
Mm-hmm.
From a neural perspective, why did the tape help him so much? Did it restore biomechanics? I don't think so. I just think
No,
it
it's
unloaded the nerves.
yep, sensory, just gave him some
Right,
sensory input that was different, and a
right.
feeling that his arm wasn't hanging. I think what's also important here is the fact that he could only turn his head 30 degrees before symptoms started.
Yeah.
And that's upper cervical when you get into that.
Mm-hmm.
When you can't go 45 degrees, you've got to start looking at that upper cervical region. And C2, C3 is the prime neural piece for the levator scapula. And it sounds like with an adducted and gripping,
Mm-hmm.
downwardly rotating scapula, that
Mm-hmm.
levator is really overfiring and over
Yes.
recruited, and probably because of the input from the joint. The
Yep.
joint position changes in the cervical spine are probably what kept those scapular muscles um, overworking, over recruiting
Yes. I agree.
into a tension myalgia type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And stretching
Mm-hmm.
isn't going to work under those conditions,
No,
which is
that's
why I was asking about, closed chain movement and, closed chain work with the wall or whatever, just because
mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
changes the pattern and you're no longer lifting up. The sense and the motor change, just seeing how it does. If it
Yep.
works differently, great,
Yep.
but
Yep.
I agree with the taping. I would have taped him that first day too and told him to stop stretching
Yeah.
and let's just start getting some movement going where we need it.
Yep.
I think the collar was a good idea. They advertise turtle collars all the time for long flights.
Oh, they do.
Yeah, so that, it wraps up around your neck and it actually holds your head so that when you
Hmm.
fall asleep, you don't end up falling asleep with your head all tossed over to the side in a
Yes.
weird position.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
to me, that was like, if his neck is bothering him, those things are like, I think especially for a flight, are like
Uh-huh.
great to use, even
Totally.
on the subway or the train or anything where you're into this, position where things you don't have any anticipation of the
Right.
sudden stops and starts and movements and things like that, like you would in a
Yeah.
car. You can see things happening. But
Yes.
so I think things like that are for people who are irritable. And he was irritable and fixing to get on a plane. I think,
Yeah.
whatever we can do to cut the irritability down. The
Mm-hmm.
stretching wasn't helping. The anti-inflammatories weren't helping.
No.
It was the input to the joints. And so it really makes a lot of sense to me when you put him in closed chain, he felt better
Yes. Yes. Yes.
because the
Exactly.
input was coming through the arm into the thorax, and the shoulder scapular muscles were able to let go, and in a certain sense because other ones were turning on,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and he wasn't having to hold the loaded under gravity position. It was just different,
Yeah.
and it was enough for him to to explore new positions and ways to do that, and lift the arms up so that they're not, everything isn't just hanging and the head isn't falling forward,
Mm-hmm.
peering into the computer screen, all of
Yes.
those things. Sometimes it's just simple things we need to do to get us out of a situation, and then we have to move into moving and loading differently, which is what I'm sure you did once he calmed down and got out of
Yes.
this tension myalgia type of
Yeah.
situation.
Yeah. And in the intro, I said that telling him what not to do was the most important. Because
Mm-hmm.
stretching was that was actually making him worse. I was pretty
Mm-hmm.
convinced of it. So, I packed him up. He went to Vegas. He actually went to Vegas, came back. felt good. And I'm like, that was just, I just had that one visit. So in the second visit, I did get him into, and I actually highlighted here in my notes, levator scap vector. I highlighted that because that was a big one. And for people who've listened to the podcast, they, I have access to Pilates equipment. So I did do for the manual therapists here and as our listeners, I did do some dynamic release with him in different positions, having him turn his head to the right, turn his head to the left, have him do some bilateral arm lifts in supine, in sitting. I had him go hands on the wall. I had my hand in his neck and my right hand on his C-spine, just doing a little decompression, my thumb on his left levator scap, having him squat, having him turn his head. You can make this up. I mean, I just had him do some movement with a little bit of sort of, 2-minute release to engage the barrier, basically, right? And so I did that in multiple positions. And I also taped him. And in terms of movement, I got him on our reformer doing closed chain, what's called a knee stretch, basically arms wide to start with. And then I just had him do some pushbacks, what's called a knee stretch in Pilates lingo. I also had him do, because he does a lot of lower extremity hit stuff, I had him go into a squat, just a basic squat. And we have a fuse ladder where I am, but you could easily take a TheraBand and wrap it around. And I actually had him do tricep skull crushers in that position. Really lightweight though. In front of, like, I had him put one foot on either side of the line to center himself. I had him do that. And then I had him do some scap pushes, more of like a more protraction and eccentric retraction with the springs behind him, but you could just do a TheraBand. Then I got him on his hands and knees and I had him do I started him once again wide with his hands and knees, hands wide. And then I had him just literally just go back and forth, head in neutral. And then as he's coming back, turning his head to the right, as he's going back out, turning his head to the left, just doing some movement. And then I had him go very narrow with his hands there. And that was a bit harder for him, obviously, even just to turn his head. So, for people who have like a multifidus or deficit or whatever you want to call that, an impairment, hands and knees can be hard for those people. Like for me, I have a lot of neck issues. Hands and knees is my reset. That makes me feel great. Just getting my head in that deep, that position. I have to hold my head up, right? And so with him, it actually caused him to recruit the muscles he was supposed to recruit, and not like the levator or the upper trap or right.
Yeah, to recruit the deep muscles rather than the other muscles. There's some good research in standing too.
Oh yeah,
for recruiting of the deep cervical muscles. Making sure that you're balancing the head so that you're not your head isn't forward, it's not retracted, it's balanced, but the chin is down. So that you're kind of suspending from the back of the head, to get in a better position for him. For skull crushers, it'd be interesting to see. They've shown that, doing various pulley work with the head to recruit the deeper muscles. The best way is for the pulley for the headband on, pull the pulley ring in front, and the weight to be just descended straight down from the head, not out at an angle or not at 90 degrees, not at 45 degrees, straight down. And the work that the head does to balance that weight is much more likely to recruit the deeper muscles. So that'd be interesting with him to have him do that as he starts to lift that arm up and see what happens.
Oh, that's interesting.
Kind of change that a little bit too. But that's a pretty good. It was a good article. They did a lot of deep muscle EMG things to really see what was actually happening there. With that musculature in line of doing pulley work, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, I love pulleys. I think that's a great idea. For the listeners, just because someone has like that, even if they have, let's say their driver is their C-spine, their neck, you can treat that. You can have them squat and still work their neck. It's not like you need to, I think sometimes become a bit pigeonholed into like, oh, I need to exercise the neck. The neck is working no matter what position you put your patient in, right? Just load them up with the arms or the legs, or do, Susan just suggested with the research, and see how they move, see what their movement strategy is like, right? This guy in hands and knees he was like, oh, this is good. I like this. So it did become his reset. Okay. And I continued to tape him. I ended up doing a little bit of work up in the COC1 area, actually, on his second or third visit, because I do agree with you. I think that little piece of that was relevant for him. And so I just did some straightforward hands-on supine on the table release work there. And then I ended up at the end giving him just a lot of, because he was very much into the gym and cable work. And so I had him just do some cable pulls. I mean, I think ultimately what you want to think about is, because we talk a lot about the thorax, patients they can brace quite a bit there. That was not his primary strategy, although that's what I saw. Okay. His primary issue was, it was a combined head and neck movement, even though he was not moving his head when I was, having him do some exercises. He had his head turned to the right during the initial injury. And I think that you want to get these people out of these strategies. And I think for him, doing movement patterns, even like a squat, and have him just, take a TheraBand around his arm. So I ended up doing this and just having him rotate, just literally do some squat with rotation. That's treating the neck. Okay. It's not like you need to do deep neck flexor strengthening or, that type of work. You're treating the neck ultimately when you're having your patient do many things. It just depends on what you think their impairment is. Okay. This guy's impairment, I didn't think he had a weak, deep system. He clearly didn't. It actually made him feel better as myself, right? I think what his main issue was integrating that with an over protective shoulder complex. That's what I think, scapular complex. And I think that's it, his left scapula and shoulder complex was more overprotective than he was strong in his neck. So ultimately, I only saw him for 4 visits. He was good on the last visit. The taping, I continued to tape him. It really helped him a lot. And so in an email follow-up, probably about a couple months later, he was doing great. So he was actually not stretching at all. And he was very much mindful of doing that work in front of a mirror. Because he was lifting very heavy weight, I had him do it in front of a mirror. And I think the visual definitely changes how we move, because patients are not aware of how they move unless you show them a picture or you have them look in a mirror. And for him, with that kind of weight, you're training the neck when you have them look in the mirror because their eyes are working, right?
Yeah. I still wonder in the back of my mind, in his injury, how much lumbar extension he was in on the bench, lifting and doing tricep work with that kind of weight.
Probably not a lot.
I'm just wondering if I'm just wondering the opposite, if he actually went into more lumbar extension to balance that weight.
Yes.
And the same in standing. And I'm just wondering if he had some sort of a compensatory response in his neck because he probably couldn't get the lumbar extension.
Yes.
So that may have caused him to turn his head, like just compensatory.
Yes.
I don't know, to maintain balance or to maintain as much midline as possible. I don't know.
Oh, it's funny.
I still think that there's probably something there. I
agree.
And I imagine that with all the work that you did, you pretty much addressed it, especially if you were doing hands and knees work with him, requiring him to actually start recruiting some deeper lumbar muscles.
Yes.
To maintain that posture.
Yeah,
and that work.
Exactly. And it's funny because I abbreviated the exercise program with him, but I wanted to talk about the connections, because I was like, why was your head turned? That was my thing. Why was your head turned? And he's like, I don't know. And I do agree with you. The L5 fracture definitely was the movement piece. And because once again, as I mentioned, because he had a neck driver and shoulder, they need to get up and move and do deadlifts, right? And they need to stand. My guess is that he injured himself doing both positions, supine on the bench, like he alternated standing supine. And I think that was that lack of lumbar extension, I think, probably predisposed him to this. I 100% agree with you. I do, and he's not going to sort of get that, but that's why I put him in front of a mirror.
Yeah. Well, and even, I think all things matter. I just think they do.
I agree.
And, it's just it wasn't showing up as a primary driver.
No.
But underneath that heavy load, it may have become a primary driver.
Yeah. And I do think that, because I didn't treat him for a long period of time. I do think that because he was doing well, and I think he had to travel again. But if I continue to treat him and we pushed through I really pushed him, that could have come up more.
Yeah.
I just wasn't didn't treat him long enough for it to happen. So because he was, fine. He was one of those guys like I can, some people just four in the visits they're good to go and I can figure out the rest. And he was doing well, but I think if I didn't put him in front of a mirror, I really don't think I think he would have resorted to that pattern, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it.
All right. Thanks,
That is
Erica.
it. You're welcome.
All right,
And
everybody. Be sure to sign up on our website for our newsletter, www.toughtotreat.com. That's where you get the latest and best information about what's going on with us and with the podcast. And if you haven't had the opportunity to leave us a review, please do so. It helps others just like you find us. And that's why we exist. So we'd love to hear from you. Keep in touch and have a brilliant start to your summer.